of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Holy Grand Duchess Elizabeth, pray to God for us. Holy St. John of San Francisco, pray to God for us. Today I want to talk to you about marriage within the context of the Orthodox tradition, how it is that we as Orthodox Christians should view marriage in general and should view our own marriages in particular. And as I begin to talk about it, I want to start with an apology. First of all, I want to apologize for giving perhaps the appearance that I might be an expert on marriage, and I'm not. I've only been married 11 years, 11 and a half. I met Father Simeon, who was married 47 years, and I said he should be up here and I should be listening to him. Because within the context of what it means to be Orthodox, and this is something that I'm going to be stressing over and over again, we learn about marriage existentially as we struggle in our marriages. And that's one of the things. So I'm not here sort of, because I did that as a Protestant. I was the marriage expert for a while, or was part of that whole thing, and I don't want you to think that I am. I'm a fellow struggler in terms of marriage. I'm still trying to figure out what marriage is all about, and I will still be trying to figure out what marriage is all about 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, because that's the nature of marriage. I also want to apologize for the seminar itself. Sort of strange to start a seminar by apologizing for it. But to be honest, I find marriage seminars to be somewhat artificial, and I think at least they're somewhat foreign to our entire tradition. It's not wrong to have a marriage seminar, but it's not the ideal way to learn about marriage. You don't learn about marriage by listening to someone talk. You learn about marriage in a context of a community in which there are good models. You learn best about marriage by watching other married people live out their marriage in front of you. And that's the way the Orthodox tradition has taught young couples about marriage for generations. It's interesting, I went through, having just been involved in the production of a book on marriage, and I looked at our tradition to try to find out all the books on marriage. And you can count on one hand all the books on marriage. And that doesn't mean that our tradition has not been concerned about marriage, because it has been concerned about marriage. But what it means is that you can't learn about marriage, how to have a good marriage, by reading a book. Books help. They take the place of things that aren't there, but the best way to learn about marriage is to live next to somebody who's married, who knows what they're doing. So the fact that we have to have such seminars, and the fact that we have to publish books, I think is a very telling indictment. An indictment aimed, first of all, at our contemporary culture. Secondly, it is aimed at the Protestant worldview which formed our culture. And thirdly, at the Roman Catholic and Western worldview which formed the Protestant worldview which formed our culture. And so as I begin, I want to begin and talk to you about whatever happened to marriage. Because there's no doubt, as we look at our contemporary world, that marriage is in big-time trouble. The statistics are incredibly alarming. First of all, the institution of marriage is in trouble. We read from our statistics that 1 out of every 2 couples who got married this summer, and how many of you were at a wedding this summer? All right, we just come to the end, and I know you guys had tons of weddings here. According to the statistics, 1 out of every 2 marriages that happened this summer will end in divorce. And the statistics tell us most likely that divorce will take place within the first 4 years. Almost half of the marriages in America break up within 4 years. In fact, it's gotten so bad. I was talking to a man whose daughter just recently got married, and he had gotten together to complain with all the other fathers about how much these weddings cost, and about the fact that they spend all this money on a wedding and then they have to do it again in 6 years. And they came up with a formula to tell whether that it had been a good investment in the wedding, and they decided you take the total number of money you spent on the wedding, divide it by the years they stay married, and if it's less than $2,000, it was worthwhile. That's how bad it's gotten. That we now consider it to be a success when they stay married enough years to make it less than $2,000 per year. That is a worthwhile investment. Marriage is in trouble. Americans have, by far, the highest divorce rate in the world. The highest divorce rate in the entire world, right here. Divorce has quadrupled from 4.3 million to 17.4 million from the years 1970 to 1994. Quadrupled, 4 million to almost 18 million divorced people. And then you add to this statistic the fact that many are choosing not to marry. Yesterday I met a young girl, she was 20, and we had a chance to talk. And I was talking to her about her life, and she was very interested in me. I can't understand why, but who are you? You know, she had never seen anyone quite like me before. So I told her I was a priest, and we began to talk. And so I said, because I was speaking today, "Are you married?" And she looked at me and said, "No." I said, "Well, are you planning to get married?" And she looked at me and said, "Why?" And so I began to talk to her, and here she was living, she's 20 years old, she was living with her fourth boyfriend. But she had no intentions of getting married, nor could she ever understand why anybody would even suggest marriage to her. 20% of all births in America are births to unmarried mothers. 1 out of every 5 babies born is born to a woman who is not married. In the 1960s, 75% of all households in America were married couples, with or without children. 75%. Now, today, less than half of all households are married couples. And the number is going down. In 1970, there was 1 lived-together couple for every 100 married couples. In 1994, there were 7 lived-together couples for every 100 married couples. And that number is just increasing by incredible amounts. And then the last statistic that scares the living daylights out of me is that a child in a single-parent home is as likely to live with a never-married parent as with a divorced parent. Which means that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kids who have no idea experientially what marriage is like, because they don't know it in their experience. And what are the chances that those kids growing up are going to get married? And if you take the statistics and you simply do the mathematics, within 4 to 5 generations, marriage will be an exception rather than a rule. And most people will not be married. So the institution is in trouble. But not only in our world is the institution in trouble, the ideal itself is in trouble. And this is more troubling to me because we are witnessing right now an incredible shift in our cultural understanding of what marriage is. Of course, the most blatant example is the recent push for the recognition of homosexual marriages. That's a redefinition of what marriage is, a radical redefinition. And of course, we found out that our culture is not quite ready to accept this. And everybody was so glad that the Senate, rejected it. But the vote was only, 59 to 41. 41 senators were ready to accept homosexual marriage. That's scary. And this is not only found in this sort of extreme example. I came across a rather interesting survey. It came to the House and it was addressed to the one who's doing the shopping. And since my wife just had a baby 4 weeks ago, I answered the thing because I've been doing most of the grocery shopping. And I went through, which do you like, Lysol or the other things, and I had to ask her because I didn't know what half the names meant. I just buy the cheapest thing. And I got to the end, and there was all this personal stuff that you had to fill out. How old you were, how many kids you had. And it's interesting, the last box was 3 and more, and since I have 4, I checked that. And then you come to this box that said, are you single? Are you divorced? Or are you married or the equivalent? That's what it said, this form, married or the equivalent. And I thought to myself, what in the world is the equivalent of marriage, right? I didn't think it had an equivalent. I thought you were or you weren't. But now you see how subtle this shift is. Now there's an equivalent to marriage. Marriage in our culture is no longer unique. It's no longer necessary, you know. You used to have to get married to have a baby and for that baby to grow up normal and be accepted, right? Not anymore. You used to have to get married to own property. Not anymore. You used to have to get married to file joint tax returns. Not anymore. You used to have to get married to get benefits at work. Not anymore. We're witnessing all around us this redefinition of what marriage is. And to me, the scariest thing about all of these statistics is that we are not simply talking about the world. That when I give you these statistics, I'm not simply talking about those terrible non-Christians over here. Because if you look at the statistics are virtually the same for the Christian segment of the population as they are for the non-Christian segment of the population. And what makes this so very upsetting to me is that as we are witnessing this destruction of marriage and the family in the Christian world, this destruction of marriage and the family is happening, or has happened, during the same time when the Christian world has been trying to save marriage. And this is the story of my life, so if you'll pardon me, I'll give you the story of my life. About 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, in the early 70s, the Christian world, the evangelical Christian world in America, woke up to realize that its marriages were in trouble. You remember the 60s had come, nobody was ready for the 60s. And then in the 70s, everybody woke up and goes, what in the world happened? Because everything got changed. And all of a sudden in the early 70s, the leaders of the evangelical Christian world woke up and said, our marriages are in trouble. And what happened in the early to late 70s was there was this incredible emphasis in the evangelical Christian world on fixing marriages. You know, I think Norman Wright's first book came out in 1975, and he was really one of the first ones. My own father, in the mid-70s, was a pastor of a very successful Baptist church. He got caught up in this. He left his pastorate. He went and he got a doctorate in marriage and family counseling. He wrote a book on marriage and family counseling. He opened a Christian counseling center for marriages and the families. And then he started going on speaking tours, speaking about marriage and the family. In fact, jokingly, I say that I have heard more Protestant sermons on marriage and the family than anyone else in the world, because from the time I was 10 to the time I left home, almost every weekend I traveled with my dad to hear another sermon about marriage and the family. So if you take that, it's 8 times 52, it's like 400 times 4 lectures. It's something like 2,000 sermons I've heard on marriage and the family. Because marriage and the family became the agenda for the evangelical Christian world, saving marriage and the family. When I came of age and went off to seminary, I followed in my father's footsteps. And so the first thing I did as a young man was I co-authored a book on marriage with him. I went and got my counseling degree. I went and I worked at a Christian counseling center doing marriage and the family counseling, and then I started doing lectures and teaching on marriage and the family. I had my own television program. I was the co-host of a live call-in television program on marriage and the family. All of this emphasis on saving marriage and the family. And of course, I'm just one example of thousands. I mean, I'm not unusual in the evangelical world over the last 20 years. This happened all over the place. How many thousands of books have been written on marriage and the family? How many retreats have been held for marriage and the family? How many seminars have been given? How many lectures? How many Sunday school classes? I mean, every year, you know, in our evangelical Christian world, there was a Sunday school class on marriage and the family, right? At least one. And this is at least 20 years now that we've been doing this. And we stand here after 20 years of all of this effort that was poured into saving marriage, and we look at marriages, and you know what? It didn't work. Because marriages today in the Christian world are worse off than they were 20 years ago. It was a 20-year experiment that failed. And I lived this. When I got married 11 and a half years ago, 3 of the attendants were already married. They're good friends of mine. We grew up together. We grew up in the same Christian world. We lived, I mean, when I was a teenager, that's all you heard about was marriage and the family, you know? And these kids grew up hearing it was prophecy in the evening and marriage and family in the morning, okay? And these kids got married. They knew marriage and the family backwards. You should see the stack of books that we had to read before we were allowed to get married. You know, we all went to premarital counseling. We did it right. Do you know that within 10 years, 2 out of the 3 couples that were married when I got married are now divorced? 66% are divorced. And I'm not unusual. I go around and I talk. I mean, I'm unusual because I've stayed married for 11 and a half years. It didn't work. We failed in our attempt to save marriage. And existentially, this is one of the reasons why I became Orthodox. Because I looked at the evangelical world and I saw that it couldn't save marriage, and then I looked at traditional Orthodox cultures. And you know what? In traditional Orthodox cultures, divorce is almost unheard of. Now, why did we fail in our attempt to save marriage? As I've looked over what we tried to do, I've isolated 2 key factors, 2 key reasons for the failure. And let me give them to you by way of introducing the rest of my lectures. First of all, Protestantism failed to save marriage because it had a faulty understanding of what marriage is. As I look back, it's amazing to me how little work we did in really trying to understand what marriage is. We assumed, on the one hand, that everybody to whom we were talking already knew what marriage was. And on the other hand, I think we were scared to death that they were going to ask us what marriage was. Because in the depth of our being, I really think we knew it was a case of the emperor's new clothes. That we didn't have an answer. And if they asked and pushed for an answer, our theology could not give an answer. I remember the first time I came across this. I was in seminary, I was engaged, and I picked up, and you have to understand that because it was existentially very, very intense for me, because I was struggling during that period of engagement to keep myself pure, and we weren't doing any of that other stuff. And I went and I picked up the Christian Reformed magazine, Christian Reformed Church, which was at that time conservative, and there was this Ask Calvin forum column that they had. And some guy wrote in, and he asked the guy who was answering it, some theologian, what is morally wrong with a couple that lives together? What is morally wrong with what they are doing if they have committed themselves to each other for life? Why is a church wedding service necessary? What is morally wrong with a couple who have committed themselves together for life? What is morally wrong with them just to go and to live together? Why do they have to have a wedding service? And this theologian, he was honest. He basically said nothing. And he was right. And I knew he was right. Within the context of historic Protestant theology, there is nothing wrong with a couple living together if they promise to stay together for life. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And you say, prove it. All right, I'll prove it. In Protestant theology, there's nothing holy about marriage. There's nothing sacred about marriage. Protestantism has adopted a distinctively non-sacramental view of marriage. And all you have to do is go to a Protestant wedding service to know that there's nothing holy about marriage. Nothing distinctively sacred about this relationship. Marriage, according to Protestant theology, is a contract. It is a legal arrangement made between a man and a woman with God as witness, or if you really want to push it, as we did, with God as partner. And you remember that wonderful verse from Ecclesiastes that a strand of three is not broken, right? It was one of my favorite wedding sermons. Now, interestingly, in historic Protestantism, when it comes to a marriage, the church is completely unnecessary. The church is completely unnecessary for the marriage to exist. In fact, if you look at historic Protestantism, it is the state who establishes the contract. The church is unnecessary. The state is necessary to recognize that this is a legal union, which is why at the end of this column, this Ask Calvin column, he said, but of course it's only morally acceptable after 7 years. And you know why after 7 years? Because it's a common law marriage after 7 years. This is why in Protestant practice, a marriage by the justice of the peace is the moral equivalent of a marriage in a church. They're not any different, whether you get married at sea by a captain, or you get married by a justice of the peace, or you get married by a pastor, it's all the same. Marriage is marriage. In fact, if you look at the services, the pastor's role in the wedding is not to represent God, nor is it to represent the people who are gathered here. The pastor's role is to represent the state. Because what does he say when he announces the couple to the church? What does he say? By the power vested in me by the state of California, I hereby announce to you Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. He is not there as a representative of God. He is not there as a servant of the Christian people. He is there because he works for the state. And he's standing there because they wanted someone who would talk about God instead of the justice of the peace who wouldn't. But he works for the state. And the state recognizes the marriage. It's a legal arrangement. And you see how they inherited this from Roman Catholicism as an aside, because in Roman Catholicism, at least the church is necessary. Because the church recognized the legal contract. Well, Protestantism got rid of the church, and it had nobody left to recognize the legal contract, so then it became statist. And the state recognizes, which is why when the state begins to go weird, like our state is going weird, you have real problems if you're a Protestant. You see, because the state's in the business of recognizing marriages, and your whole theology is based upon the recognition of the state. And if the state starts doing crazy things like recognizing two men as married, your theology can't handle that. You see what I'm saying? Now notice how flat this understanding of marriage is. You see how flat it is? Marriage is a contract, similar to every other contract except that you can't get out of it. Right? That's essentially what it is. It's a relationship established by law that you can't get out of. Unless, of course, you remember a certain passage where Jesus says that there's an escape clause. And as you look at that, why would anyone enter into it? What is there in the definition itself that would motivate anyone to enter into it, or would motivate anyone to stay in it? Just in the definition. Nothing. How does that definition inspire or motivate you in your marriage? It doesn't. Now, it can make you feel really guilty, right? That definition can make you feel tremendously guilty. And it can pressure you to do the right thing. But it doesn't motivate you. And it doesn't inspire you. And to put it quite bluntly, what we found is that guilt doesn't cut it anymore. Because for guilt to work, there has to be this whole social system that reinforces the guilt. And what we found after the 60s is the social system fell down. So nobody feels guilt anymore just because the church says you're doing something wrong. Because they go to work and they take a poll and everybody at the work says you're doing something right. You see what happened? People are not going to stay married anymore because they feel guilty about getting divorced. And so there has to be a better reason, a bigger reason to get married and to stay married. And unfortunately, as Protestants, we didn't have it. So Protestantism failed, I failed, in my attempt to save marriage. I mean, don't talk about them, talk about me. Because I didn't know what it was. Secondly, we failed because we didn't know how marriage worked. First of all, in our marriage seminars, we utilized the strategy of teaching techniques. Think about all the lectures you've been to, you know, 5 steps to healthy communication, right? How to have a better sex life. Practice and develop your nonverbal communication skills. You know, the list goes on. Think about all the chapters in the books. Basically, we used the same approach to fixing marriages as we did to fixing a car, as we did to building a deck, as we did to potty training a 2-year-old. We gave you techniques. And what has happened after 20 years is people talk real well as they get divorced. That's all that's happened. We haven't stopped marriage. We made divorce better. And so now we have this phenomena, you know, where people say it was a good divorce because we're still friends. You know, I still am yet able to understand that. You know, we talk. We go out for coffee. You know, techniques don't make a marriage. I know some marriages that are wonderful marriages where the techniques are all wrong. They do every single thing wrong. They do, you know. There's one couple, God love them, they've been married 72 years, you know. And I've watched them relate. They're my wife's grandparents. And I tell you, they do everything wrong. You know, she starts talking, he turns his hearing aid down, you know. They've been married 10 years, he went out and got a hearing aid, you know, so he could turn it down and not listen. It's not really true. They don't do everything wrong either. They did a lot of things right. But you know what I'm saying, all right? According to the textbooks, they haven't followed the steps, but they have a wonderful marriage. And I know other couples that did every single thing right and they've got a wonderful divorce. Teaching techniques doesn't save marriage. Behind this technique approach, I think, was something which was much more serious. And that was an unrealistic view of this world and what can be accomplished in this world. I liken our attempts to fix marriage like changing the bulb of a lamp which wasn't plugged in. And it doesn't make any difference what bulb you put in. If you don't plug in the lamp, it's not going to shine. For at the heart of the marital crisis is a much deeper crisis, and that is a crisis about what does it mean to be a Christian. What is life in this world like? What is its purpose and what is its goal and how do we achieve it? And this is where our Protestantism failed us, because our Protestantism taught us to believe in instant salvation, what I call microwave Christianity. And it had different names, and we all had used, you know, some of us called it name it and claim it, others said say a prayer and be guaranteed heaven. Whatever it was instant salvation. Now I ask you, if this is the fundamental presupposition of your life, think about the implications of that for your view of marriage. If your religion teaches you to hope for instantaneous, effortless, magical change, how long are you going to stay in a going nowhere marriage? Or how long are you going to stay in a marriage which is going somewhere slowly and only with a lot of work? If you've been taught that everything spiritual happens like this, how long are you going to stay in a marriage that's hard? If you are promised 7 steps to a fulfilled and fulfilling marriage, you come home, you faithfully follow them, and you're not fulfilled and you don't feel very fulfilling, how long are you going to stay in that marriage? How long are you going to work at that marriage? You know, and this was my favorite. We used to have a lecture called How to Have a Marriage That Sings Like a Canary. Don't ask me who came up with that title. I don't know. But what do you do if you, after coming home and taking all the voice lessons you can for your marriage still sounds like an ostrich? You know, and pardon me if anybody's one of those choir directors that thinks everybody can sing. I've been standing next to some of those people that they said they taught how to sing. Not everybody can sing. And not every marriage can sing like a canary. But we promised it. And we promised it 7 steps. You know, when I went to counseling from a Christian counselor, they told me that you should expect to fix the marriage in 12 weeks. 12 to 15 weeks if you do it right. We never counsel longer than 15 weeks. 3 months, my goodness gracious me, that's seculars. They don't know what they're doing. They can't fix things. They were serious. And they should have been serious because that's what their theology teaches them. And if you hear these promises and claims over and over again as a kid, which I did, what expectations are you going to bring with you, and what are you going to do when you discover that marriage is anything but instantaneous, effortless, or magical? And even if you're told, honestly, that a good marriage requires work, why should you believe it when your entire religion says that work is unnecessary? You see what I mean? We didn't have a clue how marriage worked because we didn't have a clue how the Christian life worked. And we set all these people up to believe that it was going to be easy and that it was always going to fulfill you and it was going to meet your every need. And they got married and they found out that it wasn't that way. And they said, why should we work? God will forgive. And they've been leaving marriages in drones. Marriage is in trouble. American Christianity has been unable to fix it or even slow it down. To save marriage, therefore, we must look to another tradition, to the Orthodox tradition, the tradition of our fathers, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.